Good afternoon. I have the pleasure of moderating this panel and also being the person and persons between us and the reception. So there is coffee in the back. Please get some. I am actually what's funny before I jump into this and kind of introducing myself and all that good stuff and the amazing people that we have here as part of the panel. I was just thinking about this location and talking to somebody earlier about the amphitheater being here. Those of you who's from Fresno or remembers the amphitheater that was actually literally right here. And 30 years ago, I came to a concert here. It was Radiohead with Soul Asylum and the Nixons, for those of you that maybe know those bands. And I remember meeting Tom York, who's the lead singer of Radiohead. This is right before they got really huge. And we met probably about right over there. Like we were waiting in line and the show was like right over there. It's just really, let me connect it to the panel here. It shows you how small of a world this truly is, right? And that's going to be one of the things we'll talk a little bit about today. Hello, my name is Samir Sheikh. I am the Air Pollution Control Officer for the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District. And I am so thrilled to be a part of this conference. I want to thank the organizers for having me be a part of this. And I want to thank all the panel members in advance for being amazing and offering what I think are going to be some really interesting and thought-provoking thoughts as to where a couple of really important things are. And I think it really builds really well on the last panel. And when I saw Ashley up here, I don't know if Ashley's still here, I'm like, I have to be a moderator, like, and compared to her, I mean, I've known her for a long time. As you can tell, she's really amazing. She does the elbow to elbow, and we do sprints together, and we do like huddles and all this. And I'm like, I'm not sure I'll be able to do all that, but I'll definitely be trying my best to moderate this panel. Just a couple of quick reflections as I introduce the folks that are here, and I think Tyson, by the way, is going to be on the screen when he comes up. This region is an amazing place to hold this conference. This area is ripe with opportunity for dealing with the climate challenge. And as somebody who works at a regional level on, well, air pollution is really what I've been working on for 26 years now. But several years ago, and maybe even before several years ago, and I've got one of my great board members, by the way, and Dr. Sheriffs, who you'll see tomorrow at the conference, who's been a part of this journey. Several years ago, we realized that there is such a strong nexus between the air quality challenge that we have here in the region and the climate challenge. And that's something that we've certainly been talking about, and every year we talk about it more and more. And it really is an honor to speak, a bit and to try to help facilitate a conversation here about a couple of these important areas as we think about climate solutions and what role the Central Valley plays. I look at it from the perspective of not only climate, but also what opportunities are there from an air quality perspective. And there are tremendous opportunities. There's a very, very close connection to those two things, but there's also a lot of complexity and a lot of conflicting issues that can often come up when you think about air quality and climate and you think about community. And so we're going to have some interesting perspectives today, and I look forward to hearing about this. A little bit more framing. So you go back to 2006 when AB 32 was signed into law by Governor Schwarzenegger. Next year, we're going to be hitting 20 years of California being on this climate impact journey, if you will, climate planning, climate implementation. A lot of different things have come out of that. A lot of it ends up in the news. And I know many of you here are following that very closely. Air quality. We've been implementing air quality strategies aggressively for many, many decades. If you want to just pick a milestone, the 1990 Federal Clean Air Act, and all the work that's been done since then, 26 years of that, up to that 2006 point. And then all of a sudden, now you've got air quality and climate to deal with at the same time. And so for me, as somebody who's been working for a long time and trying to figure out, well, how do we deal, for example, with the organics issues in the state, in the San Joaquin Valley? Everything from ag materials to the forest, and the tree mortalities and the 100 million dead trees in the forest, and all of the reasons that we've recently seen with the catastrophic fires down in the LA area. Just the latest example of where, as a state, we've got to figure out a way to put solutions on the ground. And I'm not going to repeat a lot of what was said earlier because it's really the same theme. It's really the same theme of, and we're going to hit on a couple of key points, hydrogen and bioenergy, And there are some amazing people that are on this panel who are leading efforts to really try to put solutions on the ground. And let's just say that the environment continues to get interesting. There's been an election and there's a lot going on, and there's a new budget that the state is negotiating right now. A lot of opportunity, but a lot of challenge. And we can never forget the fact that when we think about all of these strategies, you've got to think about communities, right? You got to think about them first. You got to think about them all the way through the process. And if I've learned one thing over these decades that I've been working on this, is that when you ignore community perspective and you don't include communities as part of the thought process, as part of the educational process, as an agency, policymaker, all the way through as part of the solutions, then you're really, really missing really the point. And so I'm really excited to introduce some amazing people that are on this panel. And I'll stop talking here in a minute because I really want to hear from them and get their perspectives on how we can put solutions into place and how the Valley can lead in these couple of really key areas. So we're going to start. Well, I'm not sure. We were kind of rearranging, but maybe I can kick it actually back over to Elizabeth. You've made it on time, and I know, by the way, she had to travel from afar and made it here. And thank you for being here. I just really appreciate you for the travel time. I'm going to introduce Elizabeth Betancourt first, who is the trying to remember the exact title, but the senior advisor, I think, on natural and working lands, or advisor to the secretary. I know her as somebody who's been working, I mean, really the point person who's working on looking at bioenergy, particularly as it relates to forest waste, but also with the ag materials nexus. Somebody who's just been really gracious with her time and coming to our board and to other bodies to talk about, what the state is working on, and hopefully maybe give us all some, not only an update, but some input into where we go next with doing advanced bioenergy, renewable energy, and using that as a solution for dealing with the climate challenge. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Elizabeth.
I am Elizabeth Betancourt, Natural and Working Lands Policy Advisor at the Department of Conservation. I'm just going to start with a big breath. I left my home in Shasta County this morning at 6 o'clock. I went to Sacramento for a budget hearing at 9:30, and I left there to come down here. And it has been a whirlwind of California, rural California, and really kind of the epitome of what we're talking about, which is trade-offs between energy, renewable energy, and what we're looking at as far as resources and time. And I am so grateful to be here. The Air Resources Districts, CAPCOA, and the San Joaquin Valley in particular have been excellent partners. And we've done some really fun work here at the Department of Conservation. I know you heard from our most previous director, David Shabazian, earlier. It's been a pleasure to work in this area, so I'm pleased to be back here again, so thank you. So it's spring, so it's beautiful and green and lovely in the valley, but generally speaking, when we think about the rural West, we think of pretty dry landscape with on-purpose watering of crops. But I would like to highlight another perspective of the West, which is independence, innovation, and a can-do attitude. I think we all have that here in California, from the drive to work with very diverse habitats and very diverse weather, very diverse people. So I think that's some of what equips us really well to deal with a changing climate here in the Western US. So we're super diverse here in California. We're the biggest population in the nation. We're the biggest economy in the nation. Some of the most challenging climate impacts in the nation, certainly the most diverse climate impacts. And we need really big solutions with multi-benefits, co-benefits to all of them. I included just a few of the state's plans and strategies and goals here on this slide. You all are probably very familiar with planning and goals related to water resources and climate resilience. Samir mentioned renewable energy, certainly air quality, pollution goals, or pollution decreasing goals, agricultural production goals, lots of goals and strategies, many of which can conflict with each other. And that's where some of the trade-offs come in. But really what I'd like to talk about is, because of our innovation and because of the resources we have here in California, I think we have a really unique opportunity to actually grow the pie. So instead of having to talk about giving up or winners and losers, I'd like to think about this as a more inclusive challenge where we can meet a lot of these goals and strategies with a brand new economy. And that is the circular bioeconomy. So probably a lot of you have heard about this. Your neighbor to the north, the North San Joaquin Valley, S2J2 region, which is Stanislaus, Merced, and San Joaquin, host Beam Circular, which is an innovation hub for the bioeconomy. A lot of those conversations happen here in the S2J2 region. Looking at how can we use the resources we have, not just money, not just natural resources, but human resources as well, and build on that to build into the future. The circular bioeconomy is a really interesting framework in that it depends on natural capital. Certainly, we need advanced technology, we need innovation and traditional knowledge, but it really relies on a diverse biodiversity as its true engine. So this comes down to things like reusing waste from cropping systems. It comes down to bacteria diversity and co-producing that alongside biochar to make fertilizer. Really innovative strategies for using waste products and things that are free, or the factor of innovation that happens in places like this here in Fresno. This is probably too small for you to see, but it's one of the best graphics that I found. I think it's from the World Economic Forum on the circular bioeconomy, and showing all of the different hubs that society benefits from when we can have a true circular bioeconomy focused on serving us and a long-term sustainability vision for our resources. So one of the biggest benefits that I see in the circular bioeconomy, coming from a rural community myself, is that the circular bioeconomy really focuses on benefits to rural communities. Biomass, really the foundation of that economy, is really heavy. It's really hard to move, and thus it's really expensive to move. And so it really creates a foundation wherein the benefits of that new economy accrue on site there in those rural communities. And then, of course, carbon sequestration opportunities abound on rural landscapes. You probably talked already today about composting. There's biochar, which the CDFA actually talked about in a budget hearing last week. There is carbon sequestration in the ground, geologically, all kinds of opportunities to capture that carbon from an industrial site and turn it into something useful. It mitigates greenhouse gases and criteria pollutants. So bioenergy in the past, and the bioeconomy in general, has been criticized for criteria pollutants and air pollution. But we do have new technology that can really help in capturing not just the greenhouse gases, but also significantly mitigating criteria pollutants like NOx, and of course, the particulate matter. And then it helps to pay for waste management. So we know as a human society, all of our efforts create some kind of waste. And if we can turn that waste into value, we can call that a byproduct or a co-product instead of waste. And then that economic activity can become more self-sufficient economically, as well as from a resources perspective. And so that creation of value helps to also create high road jobs. So a lot of the jobs in the circular bioeconomy can be filled by folks, skilled and trained workforce from the oil and gas industry, for example. And so as we transition away from the fossil fuel founded economy, those workers won't lose out. They will be able to transition pretty easily into a new economic framework. Co-products, I mentioned energy already, and carbon. And then, of course, carbon credits. That's a really significant market in the voluntary market right now, and also growing in the low carbon fuel standard cap and trade market. Carbon sequestration opportunities, I mentioned. So biomass is never going to create the massive, is never going to be a huge, massive part of our economy, but it's an important part. It's an important component from a waste management perspective. And so, for example, biomass is never going to provide the majority of our energy in this state. That's just not how we operate. And as a state, that's not what we pay for. We don't pay for purpose-grown crops for fuels, for example. We focus on waste management. But that being said, we have a lot of biomass in California. The ag waste burn prohibition, I'm sure you are all familiar with that here in the San Joaquin Valley, 1 million tons alone from the San Joaquin Valley. Municipal solid waste diversion, that 75% diversion target starts this year in every single municipality. And then from a forest health perspective, which is, as Samir mentioned, what I'm more familiar with, we have about 1 million acres a year right now coming off the forest. With our goal of treating 1 million acres a year, we'll have about 3.3 million bone dry tons of biomass. And there's some conversion factors in there that I'm happy to go into if folks have questions. But in the scoping plan, so I'm betting most of you are familiar with the California Air Resources Board scoping plan update. Their last one was in 2022. So as part of that, they project what we need to do to meet our climate goals for carbon neutrality by 2045. And so as part of that plan, they suggest that we need to actually be treating about 2.3 million acres of forest annually. And that will result in 7.7 million bone dry tons of biomass from the forest sector alone. So important air quality fact, Samir mentioned wildfires. CARB also in that scoping plan quantified the public health benefit of meeting that forest health treatment goal. And so this isn't talking about ag waste or municipal solid waste. This is just forest health waste. If we can address forest health at the rate of 2.3 million acres a year, we can accomplish $3.1 billion annually in public health benefits. That's massive. That's about $1,300 of benefit per acre of forest treated. That's a huge amount of benefit. And of course, these are similar to gains that might be had from avoiding ag burning and other waste burning. So biomass can take many utilization pathways. I've listed a few there. They are all important. I think it's really important to emphasize that we are in an all of the above situation when it comes to climate change. We want to mitigate harms, certainly, but we are at a point where we do need to do some of the crazy ideas. Some of the extreme weather events that are happening, the extreme heat that I know many of you have seen down here in the Valley. I certainly have seen up in Shasta County last year. We are in an all of the above situation. That being said, energy production from biomass utilizes orders of magnitude more biomass and smaller, less valuable biomass waste than other pathways listed there. I should add too, actually, that ammonia for fertilizer is a really important pathway for this region, especially as the salad bowl for the entire United States. We actually in California import about 95 to 99% of our fertilizer from China and Russia. But you can make ammonia from biomass waste, also from the smalls, from the non-valuable smalls. So there's some really interesting opportunities specific actually to this region and biomass. But energy, of course, another important pathway. So again, it provides some high road jobs, offsets fossil fuel use, contributes to local energy self-sufficiency, and of course, secures our supply chain for energy. I want to highlight the energy self-sufficiency element. California, of course, has electrification goals as well. That's one of our many goals. There are many places, especially in rural California, that cannot electrify. So in the Sierra Nevada, where I do a lot of my work, there just isn't the grid capacity for those communities to electrify. And I have heard from agriculturalists specifically in the San Joaquin Valley that that is the case in many places here as well. And so absent really significant grid upgrades, which certainly the state is wanting to do, but do require money and time and resources, local energy self-sufficiency in the form of hydrogen or biomethane could really help agricultural equipment, for example, to get off fossil fuels. So ag equipment could run on hydrogen, for example. Yeah, that's enough there, but happy to answer more questions about that because that's a really exciting opportunity. So what does bioenergy look like here in California? We have some existing, of course, plans and goals and mandates. That is the biomat and bioram procurement mandates. That's electricity procurement requirements on the investor-owned utilities from the Public Utilities Commission. SB 1440 is a biomethane procurement mandate on the gas utilities. You actually here in the region had a company that was going to sell to SoCal Gas and went under. And that's a really important story about the importance of all of us, local and state government, being engaged in business development and making sure that they know that we want them here. The mandate, I think, maybe isn't enough. So they need to know that we want them here, and we need to help these companies through the permitting and community engagement and siting processes. So that's another reason I should say to why I'm really happy to show up in person to these events, because I do want to demonstrate that the state is vested in the success of this industry, and happy to answer questions or to help communities out as needed in thinking through some of these strategies. All right, clean fleet mandate, low carbon fuel standard. I'm not sure how engaged this crowd is with these things, but I'm happy to answer more questions about these as needed. And then the Department of Conservation has a forest biomass to carbon negative biofuels program. We have funded a couple of projects, one of which is in this region, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then planning and the scoping plan in particular, I want to highlight bioenergy with carbon capture is one of the solution areas in the scoping plan. They also project a 1,700 times growth in the clean hydrogen sector. So that's not just bio-based hydrogen, that's also electrolysis, but CARB anticipates a huge growth in that sector. And then by 2045, 90% of our jet fuel will be SAF as well. So there's a huge expectation in the carbon sequestration capacity and fossil fuel replacement values of these fuels. We expect to see a comprehensive report on hydrogen from CARB in the next couple of years. The ARCHES, the Hydrogen Hub Awards, you'll hear more on that from Tyson in a moment. So just a quick plug, I'm from the Department of Conservation. This is a slightly unconventional space for us to be in, but we are here because, of course, our mission statement talks about fostering intelligent, sustainable, and efficient use of California's energy, land, and mineral resources. So bioenergy is one of those spaces in state government that nobody's in charge of. And so as a consequence, it can kind of get kicked under the table. So because it's so intersectional and because it fits so well with our mission and because of the leadership of former Director Shabazian, we are in this space and convening these conversations and making sure that this intersectional conversation gets advanced in state government and as local governments are interested in local government as well. So we also are the state chair of the wood utilization work group. So this work group is focused on forest biomass management, but I'm including it here because a lot of the findings of the wood utilization work group through the wood utilization strategy, which is still in draft form, are also relevant to agricultural waste management. So it's a super diverse work group. I think we're the largest of all of the wildfire and forest resilience task force work groups at probably like 40 members. It's very large. We have drafted a wood utilization strategy and really a huge portion of the actions included in that strategy, as you can see in the graphic here, we expect to come, the actions are focused on energy because we expect a huge part of the wood utilization pathways to go through energy. So we're accelerating facility development and reoperation. That's including some facilities in the Southern Sierra. There's market and regulatory incentives for biofuels and ensuring that the state maintains support for biofuels, whether that's from a policy perspective regulatory perspective, or potentially funding. Well, certainly funding given the climate bond, and I'll talk about that in a moment too. So what is happening now? So the Department of Conservation, I mentioned our forest biofuels program. We really recruited hard for tribal involvement in there, in that program, and actually we're really excited to award one of our planning grants a couple years ago to the Tule River Tribe in partnership with Core Industries to make hydrogen out of the off of Rancheria land and the Tule River Tribe. So it's a super exciting project. They actually, with that planning funding, found that the biofuels facility was too expensive for them. I think they were expecting to pay 20 million for building a facility, and the price increase got up to 90 million. So it's pretty significant change. And so they pivoted. And because of the climate pollution reduction grant program that the US EPA made available last year, they were awarded a grant to actually focus on making biochar. Oh, thank you. I'll speed through with hydrogen as a co-product. Tribes are super, super great partners in this space. They have a lot of authority and access to resources, and of course, legacy knowledge of the landscape. So I am going to speed through here and just mention biochar. As far as carbon sequestration, we're doing some really interesting collaborations with sibling agencies like the water boards and Department of Pesticide Regulation. And then, of course, there's work that the Department of Conservation is doing in partnership with the Air Resources Board on geologic sequestration. And then some of our non-state partners are actually doing some investigation of carbon sequestration into basalt formations in the Sierra, where that critical status gas actually turns to rock within a year. And so rather than storing gas underground, you're actually storing a rock. And then I just wanted to emphasize the rural community leadership. So I mentioned the great partnership with the air pollution control districts and rural communities, great conversations with communities in the Sierra as well as here in the San Joaquin Valley. This place is really well suited for the circular bioeconomy, for bioenergy specifically, with those ultra local economic benefits and the job transition that suits the workforce here. Wanted to call out the Central Valley Community Foundation in partnership with Clean Air Task Force and RAND, who did a grassroots energy study last couple years that the Department of Conservation participated in. And yeah, some of these really great innovative ideas here in the region from the Tule River Tribe, Moat Hydrogen, Kern Energy also, and the San Joaquin Valley Renewables. So that's it. Sorry for going over. Thank you, Samir.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I just listening to her, I mean, she hit on so many major topics. I mean, I know you breezed through a couple of those slides. They'll be available later. And hopefully during the Q&A, we can tease a couple of those out. I mean, but you went everywhere from bioenergy to carbon capture to just, the scoping plan. And you hit on the ag burning phase out. And I'm looking around the room. I know there's at least a few folks in here who are more than aware that just a couple of months ago, the final deadline for the phase out of open burning of ag materials is in place. And we implement that locally here. And that's a big deal. That's a big deal because everything that we used to burn in the valley, the vast majority of that is now chipped and worked back into the ground. And that's working to some extent. But what we're realizing over time is that we have a lot of other organic materials. There are some limitations to that. And so we're very, very interested as a region in exploring the bioenergy and other solutions so that we're all in, so we can maintain that and grow that and hopefully meet the 75% goal. And there are so many organics challenges here in the region and throughout the state. So thank you for that update on a variety of facets related to that. So with that, and we'll circle back on that. I'd like to now introduce Tyson Eckerly, who's with GoBiz, so California's Office of Business and Economic Development. He's Senior Advisor for Clean Infrastructure and Mobility. And in that role, he's got a very, very wide portfolio of things that Tyson works on. And we've talked over the years about many things. Hydrogen is one of those things that you hear a lot about. Hydrogen, what's in store for hydrogen? What's the future hold? And as somebody, again, in the air quality space who's worked on how do we deal with freight in the San Joaquin Valley? How do we deal with other sectors and new fuels that maybe provide solutions to the air pollution that maybe comes from some of these sectors? Hydrogen is always a part of that conversation, all going back all the way to the hydrogen highway under Governor Schwarzenegger. And fast forward, 20 years later, here we are. The state has a $1.2 billion grant from the Department of Energy to set up what's called the Arches project, which is basically a massive production project. I know I'm gonna let Tyson speak for that. I see you on the screen, Tyson. I hope I didn't butcher. By the way, all the wonderful bios for these speakers are. I'm not going to go through all the details just to save time for Q&A. But these are very, very accomplished folks that are all working on some really cool things. So Tyson, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about Arches and where's the state on hydrogen.
Right. Well, thank you. Can you hear me okay, Samir?
Yep, you're on the screen and we hear you perfectly.
Well, yeah, thanks. Sorry again, I can't be there in person. Elizabeth, great job covering a lot of ground in there. And I think this, you think about the bioenergy opportunity that we have there. If you look, like UC Ag and Natural Resources did an analysis and, all the hydrogen that we need, kind of building out the scoping plan. If you look at 2050, we could meet about 95% of our hydrogen needs with bio-based waste. So that's a pretty impressive thing if you think about what we're trying to do with hydrogen. So I wanted to start with a little bit kind of why hydrogen. And so the Arches stands, just to go before you jump in, the Arches is the Alliance for Renewable Clean Hydrogen Energy Systems. And we put this together to help organize a system of projects to go after federal funding, that $1.2 billion that Samir just mentioned. And the exciting part about this is really to pull together hydrogen. It takes balancing across multiple systems, and it's a huge opportunity. And this is a graphic that DOE had put out years ago, kind of for hydrogen at scale. But what it's communicating is that hydrogen is one of our most important energy carriers. There's no carbon in it, but the carbon would be captured or is inherent in where it's being produced for. But it can be made from renewable resources, like biomass and renewable electricity and electrolysis, but it can also be made from fossil resources. And so this kind of shows this connective tissue there. But really, it's a complementary mechanism, both if you were trying to move electrons around the state. So you have electrons and hydrogen, both carrying zero carbon energy. So if you go to the next slide, just want to talk a little bit about Arches and how we're organized. So it's a public-private partnership organized to be statewide, a statewide footprint and beyond. We had really four core founding partners. So the state, with the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, where I work, the UC, so the University of California, the Office of the President, all the campuses, the state building construction trades. So we're also a founding member. There's about 220,000 jobs that we can create with this. And so they've been a bedrock foundational partner, and then community. That was our community original partner is Renewables 100 and Policy Institute, which is focused on getting to 100% renewable energy systems. And then the fifth pillar there is industry, right? And so we can't make this all work without the industry heavily invested and involved. And we have, a bunch of different priority things going. And actually now that we're going through and reorganizing a bit how we talk about this stuff, but we want to make sure that it's statewide, it's renewable, it's enabling, project certainty. And if you go to the next slide, so we went through this robust competition to get to there, and the Department of Energy selected 7 hubs. So we're very closely aligned with the Pacific Northwest, but actually all 7 hubs are closely coordinating. It's a pretty good footprint. So, we're rooted, each working closely together, rooting for success, and success in Texas is success in California. And so we're hoping to communicate that, that nationwide approach to build out this economy and build resilience into it. So we were awarded in October of 2023 is when we were given the selection notice, and that was option to negotiate to become part of the hub. So we're essentially, we went through the application phase, the negotiation, we're done with that, we're under contract, and now we're in phase 1, which is the detailed planning. That is about $30 million from the federal government. And then once we get through there, there's this 54 go, no goes that come in, and then you can get, 15% of the funding in phase 2, then a big chunk in phase 3 when you're constructing, and then phase 4 is kind of operations. And so we have a fair amount of time. We started, like I said, in July 2024. Of course, with the federal administration change, there's a lot of stuff that's up in the air in terms of broadly funding all of these projects. But so far, we're on schedule. We've been submitting invoices, and we fully expect to be paid and move this thing forward. So that's pretty exciting going. And then part of the thing that was interesting, right? So when we go back to the beginning, we're pulling the application together. We're trying to assess like what the market potential is in California. And it's gigantic. So we did a call for proposals, not a super aggressive one. And we got over 100 proposals and $56 billion worth of proposed investment. So when you think about going after approximately $1 billion of federal investment, it took a fair amount of effort to whittle that down. And so what we did is we had about 50 independent reviewers come in, went through and scored all the proposals and really focused in on making sure that the projects, would they help enable a sustainable ecosystem? Does it bring co-funding? How does it lead to more market viability? Can we build on top of this? The point is to attract over $1 billion in federal investment. We want to make sure we're leveraging that to create opportunity, not just for the next 5 years, but to get to our 2045 targets of complete carbon neutrality. And we had a big focus on community benefits. And no matter how we talk about it, I think as Samir had mentioned earlier, it's just like engaging with the community is so important to make sure that the community is fully bought in on the projects, that we're connecting to local labor, making sure we have the trained workforce so that those benefits are transferred to those direct communities. So we're very excited about that. So after we pulled that together, we pulled a system of statewide projects and we organized them into kind of a tiering system. So tier 1 were 37 connected projects, and those are the projects that we expected direct federal funding to. The tier 2 projects are kind of the bench, like the sixth man in basketball, so to speak, ready to come into the game if any of the tier 1 projects fall out. So we had 33 of those. So these are qualified projects. It's not enough money to go around to make a market difference. On average, each project took about 10% of their project cost from the federal government. And so and they were able to take that because they're part of that broader ecosystem. And then the tier 3 is really, there's a bunch, well over 400 suppliers, technology suppliers and stuff. So part of the Arch's job is to make sure we're connecting those suppliers to the projects, giving everybody the best chance for success. And then as we're going through, we have on the Arch's website, we have what's called, a rolling RFP. So we have submissions coming in about weekly for new projects that want to be part of the Arch's ecosystem. And so if you think about how we're building this out, there's this core set of projects from the federal government will be funded, those 37. But really, we're looking at the scope of hundreds of projects to open up the market, and that we continue to collect those going forward. This is kind of how the system, broadly speaking, worked out for those 37 projects. So we have our feedstocks, renewable electricity and water on the electrolysis side. And then the biogenic side, we have, municipal waste and woody waste. And those feed into the production, so electrolysis or biohydrogen production. And then we have to get to the distribution. We have about 165 miles of proposed pipelines within the ecosystem. And where those don't go, and in the early deployments, we would rely heavily on liquid hydrogen. And then we have a marginal amount of above ground storage. Now, of course, the geologic storage down the road will be important to play, but those all feed into the offtake sector. So on the top there, we have hydrogen for power generation. So we have some large scale power plants that are good for about 200 metric tons per day. Then that helps enable, because those are secure off-takers, you can finance against that demand. That helps us get to transportation, and the transportation sector, of course, drives a lot of our climate emissions and a lot of our air, particulate matter, especially from diesel, and especially as we're thinking about all the transportation going through the valley. So it's about 252 tons per day. And then in the ports, kind of one of our crown jewels of the American economy, partnered with the ports of LA and Long Beach and Oakland, but also creating opportunities in other places. That's about 63 tons per day, and a lot of that directed towards cargo handling equipment. So that's kind of the broad system to kickstart the market. If you go to the next slide, this is a bit of the statewide look. So you can see in the valley, there's a lot of projects filling in. So this screen goes through as we build through time. So the squares are production, and then the circles are the offtake. And so a lot of production in the Central Valley for that core set of projects. You'll see on the right, we have, about 85% of our production would come from electrolysis, so like, solar and wind primarily. And then there's about 15% from biomass, but we see biomass growing considerably in the out years and hopefully even sooner. And then down on the bottom, we have some of the offtake, just how it shakes out, another way to look at it. As we go through time, you'll notice that we have ports, port power, but also aviation coming in, and then you see a big play for green ammonia as well. This is just a look at the scale. So this is a stagnant view of the state, with production in teal and offtake in orange. You can see some of the pipelines. Those aren't pipelines to nowhere. They're just what we could build between now and 2030. We look at where we are today in 2023 and where we need to get. We have to scale up considerably, about 1,700 times the amount of hydrogen that we use in 2023 need to be produced and used in 2045 to meet carbon neutrality. And you can see bringing in a bunch of other sectors like, industry, for example, agriculture, aviation. And so we have a lot of work ahead of us. This is what we view, this federal investment is what can help catalyze the market to move forward. For the next slide, we have just I'll kind of graze over that, but it's just a list of our announced projects. So the production ones, we've got 10 sites throughout California, a lot of it in the Central Valley, a couple of energy projects, Scattergood in Los Angeles and Lodi Energy Center with the Northern California Power Agency. On the transportation side, about 60 fueling stations, 5,000 class 6 through 8 trucks, and then 1,000 fuel cell electric buses. And then in the ports I mentioned already, and then kind of one of the showcase gets a lot of visibility with the Scripps Marine vessels, a research vessel out of San Diego that we're going to repower from diesel to hydrogen. I think this is an important thing to look, and sorry the fonts are a little bit off, but essentially what this is, the teal bars on there is the federal investment. The purple is the state. So the federal is in for about 1.2 billion. The state, we're working through the budget process, but our application posts about $1.9 billion in state funding. But really, the big contribution is from the partners, a lot of it from the private sector. So it's 11.7 billion in matching funds, if you put the state and the private together. But so those orange bars is the partner thing. So it's if we can combine these two sources of public funding, you can really catalyze the private market to move. And that's what this is all about. So if you go to the next slide, and I'll go over this really briefly, and then we can go one more, but just kind of the idea of moving from concept to reality. So on the hydrogen, on the trucks and buses, I have the bus behind me, as one thing. The idea is to coordinate across the stakeholder group. So have automakers and fleets and station providers all work, and hydrogen molecules working together to help reduce the cost across the system. And so we gathered input from key stakeholders to make sure we're getting the approach right. We put out a request for information. If you go to the next slide, this is a bit of an interview. The idea was to reduce the complexity of complexity and cost, and kind of one source of the truth and one place for people to go to get the funding. And the results were quite promising. And so the ideas here is, we could really, by driving scale around like 5,000 truck, 1,000 bus, you can get to a place where it's the total cost of ownership is competitive with diesel. We got some feedback, if you're able to aggregate 1,000 trucks in a certain region, we can drive the fuel costs down by 40%. We had a bus provider say they could move manufacturing to the United States much sooner, like 2 years sooner than planned, which is a big deal. And so going forward, we see a lot of opportunity, just taking the systems level approach and system level thinking to help drive investment and make it cheaper for everybody so we can get to the benefits. And the last two slides, if you go to the next one, this is, I promise to digitize this ultimately, but just wanted to show, the benefits of getting hydrogen into transportation. So if you look at this, the orange bars that I've sketched out here, that's if you use natural gas. So if you're replacing a Class 8 diesel truck with natural gas-based hydrogen and no carbon capture, you'd come out, you'd save about 8 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. So the clean hydrogen standard is 4. So 4 kilograms. If you're below 4 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen produced, that's considered kind of clean green hydrogen. If you use the Arches average, we save 18 kilograms per kilogram. And so you're having a really immense impact on carbon emissions. And then if you go to the last slide here, that really drives it. Oh, sorry, the font is terrible. I'm not sure what happened here. But Elizabeth actually mentioned about $3 billion in annualized health savings from the woody biomass, if I remember that right. For this, 37 projects is about $3 billion in health savings, and that's primarily from getting diesel off the road. On the left here, that's our Andy Warhol kind of painting. So if you look, we have the Arches sites on the top left. This is real data. Then we map the disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, and air pollution. You can see there's a big correlation of where the projects are going and where the deployments will go, and where the trucks will roll, for example. And that drives a lot of this, the economic value of avoided health cost. The other big number to pay attention to is well over 200,000 jobs are estimated from the build out of this. And especially as we're thinking about managing our transition from fossil-based industry and fossil-based transportation to zero emission. This is a big deal, especially as we look in the valley and want to make sure we have places for people who traditionally did fossil work to transition into the clean economy. And so we're giving a lot of thought to that managed transition to make sure that we can keep affordability up and prices down for everybody as we transition away from fossil to these zero emission based fuels. And we're really excited about the potential for hydrogen, and I'm happy to be here, at least remotely, and sorry I can't be there in person, and thank you for the time.
Thanks, Tyson. Really, really appreciate you for all the time you take to be a part of these forums. I know you're incredibly busy, and that state budget Elizabeth mentioned is that's kind of cooking right now, and I know there's a lot of work going into that. So thank you. I'd like to now introduce somebody that I just met recently, and really excited to continue to get to know, and certainly looking forward to hearing from you, Celina, who's actually getting her JD and PhD at Stanford, and I know has already worked for years on issues of environmental justice, climate justice, thinking about community engagement, community involvement as we transition to carbon capture and other kind of climate strategies, and just really excited to hear your thoughts on how we as policymakers, how we generally in society can do a better job in thinking about community input and perspective as we think about these really lofty and very complicated, very difficult goals that we have here. So with that, if you come up here and share your thoughts, that'd be great.
All right, so I know that I'm standing not just in between this panel and the cocktail hour, or the reception, but also in the more immediate term between this and the sort of panel discussion. So I will try to keep my remarks brief as we've gotten a lot of really rich information already. But my research looks at how can communities be effectively engaged in large-scale climate mitigation infrastructure. And so that is large-scale renewable energy and battery storage and transmission. And a lot of my work has been focused on carbon dioxide removal. So often when we're thinking about mitigating climate change, there is the direct avoidance of carbon emissions, and that is through renewable energy switching from fossil energy sources, for example. There's a sort of intermediate step where you might capture the emissions that are coming off of fossil fuel projects. That's carbon capture and storage. And then more what I think about is once carbon emissions have already been emitted, and we are now find ourselves in a world where we have, even if we were to electrify everything tomorrow, we have emitted so much that many of the most ambitious climate targets we've set as a global community could be out of reach. And so how do we not just prevent new emissions from going out into the atmosphere, but preventing emissions that are already up there and well mixed in the global atmosphere, taking those out? And so kind of a bit of a stage setter. I don't think I need to tell this room that community engagement is important, but often I kind of level set with this is something that is important, not just from a sort of, normative perspective of it makes sense to build just systems as we go, but also from a kind of project planning and financing perspective. So this is a really great study that I highly recommend reading, but that looked at rates of community opposition across the US to various kinds of energy infrastructure, and found that while, maybe at least in, I work a lot on sort of environmental justice issues, that you might assume that much of the opposition is toward new fossil fuel projects, that actually there were, similar levels, different kinds of concerns, but similar levels of opposition to renewable energy projects and carbon removal and sort of, mitigation infrastructure. And that, this came from a wide variety of stakeholders, including farmers, tribes, international organizations that then managed to have a local presence, and local governments. And so when thinking about sort of, engagement, often stakeholders who are directly involved in kind of the supply chain are the sort of, first to think about. And what I'm trying to sort of demonstrate is that there is actually this much broader ecosystem that can be activated when a renewable energy project or, carbon removal project is cited locally. And so to be, to kind of broaden the lens and when thinking about what community engagement looks like. And this has immense and immediate impacts for our ability to transition to renewable energy and carbon dioxide removal. This is another really great paper that I had no hand in, but that looked at renewable energy projects across the US and found that where there were instances of community opposition in projects, ultimately approximately half of those projects were finally canceled, and about a third of the projects that survived had significant time and cost overruns. And so this is, both important, again, from a sort of, normative and kind of, building just social systems as we build the climate infrastructure necessary to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. But also if we're, thinking about Stanford sort of, the Door School's new slogan is, speed and scale around climate change. We need to go really, really quickly, and we need to build really, really big. And this is always sort of, at least to me, a bit of a word of caution that if we're not bringing folks along and they're not seeing the kinds of benefits that have been talked about in this room on the last panel and on this panel as well, through economic and sort of, other participatory means of benefiting, that this can, stall projects and ultimately be counterproductive. So one of the projects that I have been looking at is around what's called direct air capture. And some of that work has taken me to Kern County, thinking about direct air capture in that setting. And so direct air capture is this large kind of infrastructure-based approach that takes large fans blowing ambient air, any air that you would see outside your window, through a filter that then selectively captures carbon dioxide. And once that carbon dioxide is captured, it can be pumped underground in existing geologic reservoirs, or as Elizabeth was talking about, new methods of chemically reacting it with basalt and other geologic layers in order to what's called mineralize it. And that takes on the order of, kind of a couple years. And the US bipartisan infrastructure law in 2021 had the largest, there we go, investment in direct air capture, not only in the country, but in the world to date, signaling the then Biden administration's interest in making the US a leader in this kind of emergent industry to remove, again, past emissions out of the atmosphere. And many of these projects since 2021, when the bipartisan infrastructure law was passed, and today have been announced for Kern County and or kind of the broader Valley region, identifying potentially the opportunity for a just transition, kind of taking oil and gas and doing it in reverse. Instead of taking carbon out of the ground and burning it, now pumping it back into the ground. But then also raises some of, the kinds of environmental justice questions that have been raised around traditional energy extraction and processing, around why should communities who have contributed the very least to climate change now bear the responsibility of cleaning up past emissions from the atmosphere, not just preventing emissions in the first place, but cleaning up essentially someone else's emissions. And so we set out with a team at Stanford and with Data for Progress, a national policy organization, to try and figure out sort of, before these projects were cited and announced, how might community members think about, direct air capture? And a couple things emerged. The first is I think an optimistic one, is that this was a collection of, or an assembly of about 20 community members whom we recruited through a focus group recruitment agency that runs all sorts of kinds of focus groups, but to try and get sort of rough demographic representation and folks who had sort of, never heard of this and maybe hadn't been super politically involved, or maybe they had been, but to get kind of a broad swath of the kinds of people who might read their morning newspaper and say, oh, that's coming to town. Like, how do I feel about it? And the kind of the optimistic point that I sort of, started with is that, people wanted to find something that was like workable about a plan like, direct air capture. And so we saw, pretty overwhelming 75% support in post surveys when we presented sort of, scientific information about here's what direct air capture is, here are the potential benefits, here are the potential risks. And there was a big asterisk on the 75%. We did essentially, community planning sessions around where might make most sense for something like this. What are the kinds of concerns? How might those concerns be guarded against? And over the course of, 3 hours, we were able to come up with sort of, community design principles for what direct air capture might equitably look like in Bakersfield specifically, and broader Kern County. And the residents that we talked to, and we talked to many kind of across the country as well, to try and figure out, was this something that, might be of interest? We heard a lot of excitement about a kind of, community-led process for direct air capture, and then potentially community ownership of direct air capture. And this second piece was responding to what I think is a real tension or a real trade-off when we're scaling renewable energy and carbon removal that we're often not talking about, is that one of the ways of driving down cost curves of expensive or emergent technologies is to automate, and automation reduces jobs. And so often when, job projections are presented around, these kinds of like new and big and exciting infrastructure projects, they're often in the construction phase. And so there's a real policy gap. And this was one of the things that, we heard from residents, and we have since heard from environmental justice groups as well, who work in Kern County, is that, the necessity of like creating a workforce that exists beyond just that kind of construction phase is something that's really important and, difficult, but sort of often overlooked. And then there was a kind of a grappling with, and I think, this comes up in hydrogen as well. Arches is, renewable electrolysis, and biohydrogen, but a sort of grappling with, how do we get from the reality that we're in right now to the sort of the thing that we're looking at in the future. Does fossil energy power these kinds of new projects that we're setting up until we're able to transition them to renewable energy? Or do we try and build the renewable energy capacity today in anticipation of the things that we're expecting to come down the pipeline? And this is a small n study, so, qualitative work, but general consensus sort of emerged around, we need to figure out how to build the thing that we want ultimately in the future, sort of, now, and not, wait around for conditions to change in order then to sort of transition. So instead of this kind of like bridge idea of a bridge fuel for something like, direct air capture, you can power it by natural gas, for example, that there was a need to sort of, even if it was kind of hard in the short term, to set up something that was kind of like best in class. And we then sort of took some of these hypotheses around the things that folks said in this Bakersfield focus group and tested them on a national stage to try and understand how much did people care when they were looking at direct air capture, but you could swap in another kind of large scale climate infrastructure. How much did they care about where the funding was coming from, about who owned the project, about the energy source of the project, et cetera, et cetera. And for the most part, when interacting with a new kind of infrastructure that folks had never heard about before, sorry, I think this gets cut off if you can't see. The middle line is 0, and anything that's in this direction is negative, and in that direction is positive. And essentially anywhere where you see these bars crossing 0, statistically insignificant. And so we saw a lot of statistical insignificance, but 3 things emerged that were echoed in the qualitative work that we did, was that people really cared about the funding source, who was paying for it, especially when thinking about carbon removal, which is a kind of, a waste cleanup problem. We now have this waste source, carbon dioxide, up in the atmosphere, and how do we clean it up? And if the project were funded in any way by the public, if it was a public tax, for example, this was less likely to be prioritized than a project that was either directly funded by industry or indirectly via taxation mechanism on industry. The second thing that emerged was that high levels of community engagement, community participation, not just in a kind of, comment comment and sort of town hall input, but real community participation in the planning process itself around, again, sort of, where would it go and what are the kinds of fuel sources and who are the kinds of workforces that need to be recruited. And then long-term long-term jobs also increase the likelihood of choosing a project package. And so in kind of conclusion, community engagement and jobs creations were the things that the national public, but echoing what we heard in qualitative focus groups in Kern County, were really important to increase support for projects, suggesting that the mechanisms by which projects are developed are in some cases more or equally or more important than what the project is itself, some of its like technical specifications. And then lastly, that the funding source, at least for, carbon removal, we think that there's something kind of specific about this because it is a sort of, cleanup problem, and it asks like who is responsible for the, the waste that now needs to be cleaned up. And so I'll stop there and look forward to discussion.
I'm looking at the time, and so we have about 20 minutes to chat with these folks about a lot of things that were just covered. And I've got a couple of questions, but before I jump into it, I'm not sure I've got enough time if Ashley's still here or not. And I'm not going to do the 5-minute elbow to elbow. I'm actually just going to jump right into it. And I'm going to look around the room and see if anybody, and I think we got Kamala here with a microphone, looking for hands to see if there's any questions. I see one over here. And don't miss this opportunity to ask some folks that are doing some really cutting edge work. And I actually just, Celina, just a lot of appreciation for, I didn't realize that you had worked as extensively as you did in that Kern County project. It's definitely something that gets a lot of attention in the San Joaquin Valley. So fascinated by what we just had to say. So definitely don't miss the opportunity to ask questions. So we'll jump over here.
Hi, Ellen Weir. I work with a number of water districts in the North San Joaquin Valley, but this is a really fascinating panel, much more interesting than I thought it was going to be.
Take it.
And I echo you, these projects are getting a lot of attention because there's a lot of questions about how it will roll out and what communities and landscapes are going to be affected. To the guy who was talking about the arches and the community engagement person, I'm just wondering, like, I just went on the arches website and tried to look up what that map of all the hydrogen projects in the valley is actually about. And there's a 100-page memo on there that's almost completely redacted. I've also tried to look up some of the carbon capture and sequestration injection projects in the areas that I work at, where our landowners are being approached for options. They are being approached by companies trying to buy easements for this carbon sequestration, and there's been no outreach to the local special districts and local agencies. And so just, I hope this isn't too controversial of a question, but when I see these programs being rolled out under the state banner of like, this is a state plan, but then you try to find more information and it's all redacted. I totally understand. I'm a lawyer. I know that land optioning and private land investment is really sensitive, but I worry about that balance between state-sponsored planning and industry investment, that it looks from a totally outsider perspective like it's being done in a black box. And so I'm sorry to throw a really controversial question at you, but I'm just really curious about this, and it seems like the right group to ask it to.
Tyson, did you hear all that?
Yeah, I did. It's not controversial. It's no problem at all. So like, essentially just a matter of process and timing. So right now we're just in the detailed planning phase of this, and the limitation on sharing the projects is based on, what DOE has allowed us to share and what our project partners have allowed to share. So none of the projects will go through and be invested in without the full public process. So we're going through NEPA right now. We'll have the CEQA process, and community engagement is built into the very foundation of how we're going to roll out projects. We're just not quite to that point yet. And some of the projects, for example, their location isn't 100% locked down. There's a bunch of different confounding factors, but they will be made public. And so we've shared, and part of the things, even one of the memos that we had on DOE that had some of the fact sheet stuff that was taken down by the DOE, I think we've found it again, but so through time, it'll get much more clear. We're not trying to be obtuse by any stretch, and we also pushed to release that 100-page memo is actually the application we sent to the DOE. So the stuff that's redacted is all proprietary information that was sent to Arches, then we sent to the DOE, so we can't share that. And so, but we wanted to be as transparent as we could be. Hopefully that helps.
Let's see a couple of more questions. There's
Yeah,
one
sorry,
here,
can I
here.
Can I
That's
also
yes. Go ahead.
tackle
Yes.
that question? I think this is maybe one of the ways that hopefully academic partnerships can help to answer some of these questions for communities. The work that we did around sort of like understanding how do communities sort of, feel about this was then, also informed kind of how DOE, maybe not as directly as I would have liked, but like how DOE was sort of, selecting projects and the kinds of things that they were sort of looking for. And I think that there's just a much larger role for academic institutions that, have some amount of kind of, freedom to, talk about at least the ideas that, they sort of work on, that aren't blocked by sort of, IP challenges. And I appreciate the encouragement to continue to make these things transparent. I think one of the things that is frustrating to me about, for example, geologic storage is that a lot of the research that has created the opportunities for geologic storage, and I think there are some really exciting ones, were created with public dollars, but are now locked behind IP vaults. And there's a conversation for us lawyers to have about how to bring some of that, publicly funded research back into public domain. And then the second thing that I'll say is that sort of, one of the, I think there is a very important infrastructure development model that is, some like developers and, the state sort of determine that a project is important and then kind of, do community outreach. And I think that that's really important. And we're seeing really great, state leadership. And one of the hopes that I have is that, it can also be bottom up, that community members can have the kinds of information on what the options are and then select, like, we want to host a solar farm and here are the considerations, and then have kind of more local direct community ownership and oversight.
Thank you. And actually, you've inspired me to ask a related, maybe follow-up question. And I think it's probably in the minds of some here. We're going to get to, there's a couple of hands that were up. But if I may, Tyson, just to build a little bit, looking at your maps, and by the way, the questions that are being asked have been asked recently. And I think it's definitely a great area for all of us to kind of keep working on as we think about arches and some of the related projects. One of the questions that keeps coming up is, how do we as a region not only produce hydrogen, but how do we also benefit from the hydrogen? How do we become a big part of the offtake, if you will, or whether it's freight or other sectors, given the air quality challenge, given how many of our communities here are socioeconomically, environmentally impacted. The San Joaquin Valley is home to many of the state's most impacted communities. And the more you talk about this, there's a lot of design going in kind of from governmental folks and hopefully increasingly at the community level as all of this kind of plays out, but me as an air quality guy, somebody who's working on trying to clean up the air here, I'm super interested in not only producing the hydrogen or seeing it being produced, but how do we benefit from it, right? And that's something that it's kind of an ongoing question. I don't know, Tyson, if you had any, I know you've talked about this a little bit before, but did you have any thoughts to share on that front as well?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to enticing fleets to jump in. So when you think about how a lot of the air quality benefits will be driven from replacing diesel. And so right now we have not selected the OEMs or the fleets for this process. And that's part of the request for information that we put out on our truck and bus strategy. So the way we envision it happening is kind of, building the stations based on the demand that comes in from the, kind of where the fleets are going. And so if we can entice fleets that traverse the valley to be first in, that is really, I think that's a way to replace diesel directly. Then that's kind of in the direct, kind of within that federal part. And then more broadly speaking, we have this rolling RFP and we're trying to enable the whole ecosystem and bring transparency between the supply side and the demand side. And so the more we can organize, both on the demand side, let's say, it's green ammonia in the valley or truck use or bus fleets, all of those things, if we can aggregate that demand, then we can connect to the supply and really drive it to be the, the first region for adoption.
Thanks, Tyson. I believe I just heard, I'm not quoting you on this, but a budget request perhaps for San Joaquin Valley dedicated funding for trucks and other technology, but maybe that's my own request. But
Fair enough.
I know there were a couple of hands up, so maybe we'll start with, I saw, I don't know who was first, but the gentleman over here, and we'll get to this hand as well.
I've heard conflicting data about the efficiency of converting solar or wind to hydrogen. I've heard 50%, I've heard 20%. We know that our particular solar facilities in California right now, at certain times of day and certain times of the year, are wasting tremendous amounts of energy. We're either giving it away for practically nothing or shutting them down. Under that, why aren't we converting that to hydrogen now? And how do we continue to incentivize people to build these facilities when they're wasting the product at the rates that they are right now?
No, it's Samir, I can jump in if that's okay. I mean, you raised a great point. It's a huge opportunity. I think one of the big things, big victories we got on a policy front is the hydrogen production tax credit that the Biden administration finalized right at the end. The details are, there's a lot of detail in there, but essentially we were able to get an exemption for California that recognizes our unique climate policy framework to make it easier to do just what what you're looking for. And just kind of to put it in context of the curtailed energy. So if you took all the curtailed energy from 2023 and put that into hydrogen electrolytically, you could meet about 22% of our demand that is projected for 2030. And then just a year later, it would be 28%. So it's an opportunity that continues to grow. And so one of the things that's really exciting about hydrogen is we can start to benefit and utilize all of that energy. So I think, putting solar and direct into the grid is always the first choice, charging batteries and stuff, but then having hydrogen there. And then, of course, that opens up the diversification of use. And so we're really excited about that opportunity. So efficiency. And then we're partnered with the UCs and the national labs and companies on driving efficiency of electrolyzers. So you'll see that continually improve. But even without efficiency gains, there's a huge amount of opportunity to capture the curtailed energy. So, and then hopefully drive the economics and encourage more and more investment.
Thank you very much. I'm Jack Caramini. I'm an agriculturalist and a businessman in the Valley. This is a very exciting time. Solar, hydrogen, all of these great technologies coming online. Well, my question is, as we've evolved, as we've come up with new technologies, we now know that we can measure carbon that's coming out of the atmosphere. There's marketable products, CDRs, that are being sold and traded on a voluntary market. The state of California and the federal government has shown through the Direct Air Capture and the Infrastructure Reduction Act really went about picking winners and losers on technology. We have cap and trade being done this next year in AB 32. Has the state, or is there consideration of trying to take the state out of picking winners and losers, but rather creating a marketplace in California by buying CDRs directly? And so we're not debating about whether the trees that we planted got burned or whether direct air capture is the most efficient way of doing things, but rather let the entrepreneurs in a verifiable process, probably very similar to the biomap process, go out and buy and put forward opportunities for the state of California to actually make a credible investment in greenhouse gas reduction. With that purchase order and the full faith and credit of California, you can then go finance this through private sector banks and others. It does take the state out of the position of picking winners and losers, but it also allows the entrepreneur to perhaps solve some of the state's problems. So I would like to ask, is this something that's being considered? And can we create a new industry by actually creating the marketplace here in California?
So I will defer first to our esteemed state representatives that are here to see. Elizabeth, I know you want to jump on. Maybe Tyson, if you have anything else to offer.
Yeah, Tyson might have more detail on exactly what you're asking, Jack, but I will say that CARB's inclusion of biomass as a feedstock for LCFS demonstrates their willingness to begin looking more broadly at opportunities across the board for carbon sequestration and the carbon negative fuels. The budget situation being what it is, I'm not sure about the state buying credits, but Tyson, maybe you heard differently.
Yeah, I haven't heard on the buying credits piece, but I think your points are well taken. Like we don't want to be in the business of picking winners and losers. We want to set a performance standard and let the industry innovate. So that's part of like the zero emission vehicle program. Of course, you have to, it's a zero sum game at some point, right? If you're investing in batteries or hydrogen, and the more certainty we can give to those various technologies, the more private capital you can bring in. But you look at things like the green bank concept, and we'll see how that rolls out with the new administration. But like the EPA's green bank program that comes to the iBank, some of the ideas there is to backstop, on a loan loss basis and allow entrepreneurs to go and solve the problems that we're all trying to solve. So I mean, definitely hear you, and we are all ears in terms if you have ideas on how to make this work and make it easier, we want to hear them so we can implement, because we have a lot to solve, and we can do it more on sound economics and entrepreneurial spirit and tap into everything that we've do well in California. We want to do it.
Yeah, and I might just add to that, Tyson, the fact that there have been 2 or 3 bills over the last 2 years that tried to define green hydrogen that died. I think that that's a statement of the administration, or at least the legislative process, of an unwillingness to narrow the field, and the calculation of benefit based on carbon intensity rather than process definition. I think that those are all really promising as well.
And I'll just one quick note on that. It's a great question. And I think I'll just make a plug for advocating. This is a very key moment, I think, for California. We have the cap and trade program. Just a quick note on that. It's expiring in 2030. And so I think the thought is that the state legislature, and of course at the end with the governor, could consider and should be considering the reauthorization of that program sooner rather than later. And so we're in the first year of a 2-year legislative session. And I think that if it's not done this year, maybe it gets worked on and gets done in the second year of the session. We've taken locally, through the Air District, a position that we'd like to see it reauthorized, and we'd like to see another important component of that, which I think gets partially to your point, which is that we need to really rethink the way that we've been investing, say, the greenhouse gas reduction funds that are parts of the cap and trade program. Those of you that track that may have seen, I think it was this morning, we saw the latest California and Quebec auction results post. And I'm not going to give you my analysis of that just yet. I need to look at it a little bit closer, generally down a little bit. But as to whether or not that's significantly down or not. And, I think that there's some instability potentially in that market. And so I think what we've been looking for is definitely, more investment in programs and projects that provide a more immediate direct benefit to our communities, that reduces climate related pollutants, greenhouse gases, but as well as reduces local diesel, NOx, other pollutants that are a bit of issue here in the San Joaquin Valley. Because we have actually seen for a couple of years now those funds diverted away from that purpose because of the state budget situation, the deficits. I'm free to be able to speak to this a little bit differently than perhaps others, just because I think that as we think about the negotiation this year on the cap and trade program and on the budget, and also with what's happened at the federal level, right? We've seen there's been an upending of sorts on things like the transition to electric trucks with the withdrawal of the advanced clean fleet regulation. As just one notable example, the question that I have, and I think the question that a lot of us have is, where are we going to go from here? How do we pivot? How do we make sure that we still have incentives for fleets to move towards advanced technologies? How do you position the dollars that are tied to programs like cap and trade to support that? And how do you let the market sort of move forward in a positive direction without over design and with proper incentives in place that are more fuel neutral, but still get you to the goals that you need to get to? And so that just a little bit of a plug for advocacy, and we're doing our best locally, and it's a very, very complicated situation right now. I hear a timer just went off. It was probably the 0 mark over here.
Look into the carbon.
Does that leave me room for any, do you have a closing
Four
comment?
Corners carbon initiative between 4 states. New York State has a reverse auction process for carbon removal that it has kept technology neutral, and it may be going away soon, but there's a federal experimental procurement for CDR that does exactly this. Just places to look.
There you go. Great. Any other last minute plugs or anything you want to get out there to the audience?
I just want to cheer Celina's work in community education and that early input. If there are developers in this room, and I think that there are, the importance of engaging with the community before the rumors start to circulate and the tension builds is like, there's no way to overstate the importance of that. And, you know, as I have said in other groups, we are happy to help as far as supporting information and fact-based information sharing. The Department of Conservation has an amazing community facilitator if a community is interested in having conversations like that. So that work is super important, and just like take that to heart.
And one of the slides I didn't get to is that often state, local government, and like, you know, people seen as third parties are the best people to facilitate those early discussions, whereas like it can be seen sometimes that industry might have ulterior motives. And so take advantage of these partnerships, and I'll add my name to the hat.
And I think that's a really good note to end on. I mean, we need collaboration. The challenges are huge, but there's huge opportunities, and we're all trying to do better. And I want to echo Elizabeth's words about your advice, Celina, and I appreciate the work that's going on at the state level in an increasingly difficult and complex environment. And because we're out of time, thank you guys so much.